Welcome everyone back to the second day of the Wallace Stegner Center's 28th annual Symposium on the future of the Great Salt Lake. I'm Bob Keiter. I've had the privilege of serving as the director of the Stegner Center for the last 29 years, much to my own amazement. And we're very pleased to have everyone here with us today to address this very important topic, both to the state of Utah and more broadly across the country in Saline Lake country, not only in the United States, but beyond. We'll get to some of that in just a minute or two this morning. Let me begin with our native lands acknowledgement, as we always do at the Stegner Center events. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between the many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government. And we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. An announcement on behalf of the Wallace Stegner Center's Environmental Dispute Resolution Program. It is currently accepting applications for the 2023 Collaboration Certificate course. This is a 7-session online course that teaches mid and upper level professionals working in environmental, natural resource, and public policy issues, the quote, art and science of collaborative problem solving, something that certainly relates to what we are discussing this past day and today. Applications are due April 30th. And for more information, you can check the EDR program at law.utah.edu. Let me also take this opportunity to thank our principal funders and sponsors, the R. Harold Burton Foundation, our founding donor for this 28-year annual symposium program. As well as the Cultural Vision Fund, and we are sponsored also by the S.J. and Jesse E. Quinney Foundation and the Nature Conservancy of Utah. A few logistics to keep in mind here. In the interest of time, we're only going to introduce speakers by their name and title, with the exception of keynote speakers and high political figures. There will be food and beverage, as you've noted coming in, available in the lobby during the breaks, and you're welcome to bring the food into the moot court room. If you need to leave during a presentation or come in late, please use the side entrances here on the east side of the room in the building so as not to disrupt presentations. For our question and answer session, we'll use the Slido technology, and the instructions are available on the screen and on the symposium website to make use of that. Please silence cell phones. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our initial speaker this morning, Professor Alyse Bertenthal, Ph.D. and Assistant Professor of Law at Wake Forest University, who will give us a sense of how other locations have dealt with Saline Lake issues. The title of her talk is Decades of Dust, Lessons from California's Owens Lake. With that, Alyse, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you to all of you for being here so early in the morning. These are the times that I'm very glad I'm still on East Coast time, especially because I'm going to ask you to imagine that it's actually even earlier in the morning. I want you to imagine that it's 2:30 in the morning on March 26, 1872, and you're living in Swansea, California, which is on the very edge of Owens Lake. Swansea is, of all things, a port town. There's a wharf at Swansea. It's at the northern end of the route it's taken by two steamships that take silver ingots from a big mine that's in the Owens Valley called the Sierra Gordo mine. It ferries them across the lake to a little town called Cartago, which is actually where there's a rail line, and then they load it onto a rail car, and the ferries return with supplies they take back to the mine. It's a happening place in Swansea, California. But of course, none of that is happening at 2:30 in the morning. Instead, what's happening is there's a giant jolt in the middle of the darkness, and people feel this, and they run out of their houses, and they look into the lake, and they see all of the water receding to the middle of the lake in a giant wave. And this, as you can imagine, is terrifying, because what goes out usually comes back in, and everyone's afraid that this huge wave is going to come back in and engulf the town. And that would be the end of Swansea. Well, it was the end of Swansea, but not because of a tsunami wave. The water never came back to Swansea. It only came back to about a quarter of a mile from the shore and at a very, very low depth. So the whole town, you see, the whole lake had tilted to the west. The March 26, 1872 earthquake was a gigantic earthquake, one of the largest earthquakes in the history of California. And that's exactly where this water, you can see it's very hard to become a port town. You can see how large this earthquake was, that it ended up tilting the entire lake to the west. This had huge effects on Owens Lake. And I start with this story because I want to give you a moral. The moral of the story for Owens Lake is that it's a place that's subject to great change. And sometimes it's subject to change in a great big hurry. Today, I want to talk with you about one of the biggest changes for Owens Lake, which is the loss of its water. And I want to talk about what it's like to live with a lake that has lost all of its water. I want to describe for you the disintegration and the eventual rehabilitation of a dry lake bed. And I want to offer all of this because as you look to the future of the Great Salt Lake, you can glean a lot of information and a lot of insights from the past of Owens Lake. So over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a picture of the Owens Lake with the purpose of helping you to better see what's possible for the Great Salt Lake. Of course, there's no view from nowhere, and what we see and what we interpret is informed by where we're standing. As you know from my introduction, I'm not a high political figure, so let me just tell you a little bit about who I am and what my vantage point is. I'm a professor of law. My area of interest is environmental governance, which broadly means I study how decisions about environmental conditions are made and carried out. I'm also trained as a social scientist, and I use empirical methods to study the social interactions and their relationships that inform decision-making and implementation. What I want to share with you about Owens Lake primarily comes from a multi-year research project, which draws primarily from anthropological methods, such as interviews and participant observation. I lived in Southern California for more than a decade, and I made frequent trips to the Owens Valley, where I got to know more about the people who live there and the issues that they faced. In 2015, I received a grant from the National Science Foundation, and I moved to Owens Valley, where I observed and worked with residents, scientists, and government and tribal officials to study approaches to mitigating environmental problems, especially on Owens Lake. I spent a year living there full-time in the Valley, and the next 3 years traveling back and forth between the Valley and Los Angeles to work on this particular project. And what I'm going to share with you in this talk, and especially the insights that might be learned from Owens Lake, come from that long-term research project about environmental governance in Owens Valley and on the lake. So here's what I plan to cover today. First, I want to provide you with some necessary contextual and historical background. What is Owens Lake? Why did it dry up? And why might it be a cautionary tale for Utah and the Great Salt Lake? Next, I want to give you some more information about the status of Owens Lake, and especially what's being done to address the problems this massive dry lake bed has caused. This might be a useful touchstone for you all as you're thinking about proactively remediating the problems that are going to happen on Great Salt Lake and are already happening. I want to conclude by summarizing some of the lessons that we might extract from Owens Lake. 30 minutes isn't a long time, and I'm going to necessarily paint these lessons in broad brushstrokes. Hopefully we'll have some time for some questions at the end, and of course I remain available to talk about all of this later. What I really hope to do is give you a picture of the Owens Lake as a means of thinking further about the Great Salt Lake. There have been many mistakes and some incredible successes, and taking the time to reflect on all of this can provide some insights for Utah, hopefully providing you with some better information about how to chart a different path and a different future from the Great Salt Lake than what we've seen on the Owens Lake. Let's start by just giving you some history and context. So the story of Owens Lake began millions of years ago, when freshwater lakes covered the western Great Basin, which holds Owens Valley, California. The Owens Valley is situated here where that red dot is, about 250 miles northeast of Los Angeles. The Owens Valley is home to about 40,000 people, including military personnel and their families who live in Ridgecrest. Then there's some smaller towns, Olancha, Lone Pine, Independence, Big Pine, and Keeler. There's also 5 tribal reservations, which includes the Paiute and Shoshone peoples. Wedged between the Sierra Nevada mountains to the west and the White and Inyo Mountains to the east, the valley extends more than 100 miles north to south. The landscape is defined by miles of desert sagebrush beneath snow-capped peaks, gurgling brooks lined with cottonwood trees. The palette of desert colors reflect under a shifting sun. It's really difficult to describe this place without lapsing into overwrought descriptions. Our cliche, bold, awesome, and majestic are the adjectives most frequently used to describe this picturesque part of the county. It's a place that captivates residents and visitors alike. As one local author put it, it casts a spell of the land over all the men who had in any degree given themselves to it. Now, Owens Lake, which is situated in Owens Valley, is the remnant of a large prehistoric freshwater lake that extended some 60 miles up and down the Owens Valley and was sometimes over 300 feet deep. Over time, it became known as what's known as a perennial lake. At times, it was so deep that steamboats were needed to cross it. And at times, you could just walk right across it, just waiting. The indigenous Paiute and Shoshone peoples knew the lake as a kingdom of irrigated villages, plentiful game. Later, after white settlers arrived in the Owens Valley, they knew it as something much darker. Tribal oral histories and military records document several massacres of Native Americans on the lake. Artifacts unearthed from the lakebed include cavalry uniform buttons, musket balls, grinding stones, arrowheads, and human remains. The lake lies at the terminus of the Owens River, which is also its primary source of water. So to understand what happened to Owens Lake, you have to understand what happened to the Owens River. The Owens Valley was historically irrigated, first by native peoples and then by ranchers and farmers. Between the 1860s and 1880s, irrigation using Owens River water increased significantly. To give you a sense of how much this increased, consider Mono Lake, which is just about 100 miles to the north. In the 1880s, wet water years throughout California caused Mono Lake to rise by some 20 feet. Irrigation was happening so much in Owens Valley that during that same period of time, Owens Lake dropped by 16 feet. And the reason for that is that by 1890, 41,000 acres were under irrigation. And all of this irrigation was done by diverting water out of the Owens River, away from Owens Lake and into irrigation ditches. So Owens Lake was in trouble long before anyone even knew it was in trouble. And I suspect that if the lake hadn't dried up entirely due to irrigation, it would have been at least severely compromised. But before anyone had a chance to test that theory, something far more catastrophic happened. In 1905, agents of the city of Los Angeles came into the Owens Valley and started buying property. And the reason they were buying property was to secure the water rights that attached to that property, because they had plans for the water in Owens Valley. And every time they bought the property, they took it out of irrigation, and the water was returned to the Owens River and eventually to the lake. So during this time when they're gathering property so that they could get water rights, between 1905 and 1913, the waters of Owens Lake rose by 13 feet, yet more evidence that irrigation is causing this diminishment of water. And as I said before, change comes often to Owens Lake. In 1913, though, things changed again. That was the year the Los Angeles Aqueduct opened. The aqueduct was built by William Mulholland and was widely celebrated as an engineering marvel. It carried water from Owens River and its tributaries through deserts and mountains across 250 miles to deposit it at the mouth of thirsty Los Angeles. It delivers more than 650 million gallons of water a day. At times, it accounted for more than 80% of Los Angeles' water supply. Now, as water was diverted to the aqueduct, the Owens River stopped feeding Owens Lake. And by 1927, Owens Lake was dead. It was just a large playa. You had basically 120 square miles of dried up lake playa. And then came the dust. The lake bed is covered in very fine dust, comprised of elements such as arsenic, cadmium, sodium, chlorine, nickel, and magnesium. Now remember that the lake bed is situated between huge mountain ranges, and the valley often becomes a funnel for massive windstorms. Winds over the lake bed regularly exceed 20 miles per hour, and it's not uncommon to have gusts as high as 40 to 50 miles per hour. The winds pick up trash, dirt, shrubs, and especially dust. Keep in mind that there's 110 square miles of the Owens Lake bed. It's a lot of dust. And in 2001, the 10 highest recorded dust events in the nation were all at Owens Lake bed. By one estimate, before remediation started taking place, the lake emitted up to 8 million metric tons of dust per year. Now, these generate huge clouds of dust, clouds that rose 30,000 feet in the air. And those clouds can travel very, very far. Residents of Big Pine, which is more than 60 miles north of the lake, told me that the dust would regularly get into their homes, cover their cars, coat their desks at school. Ridgecrest, even though it's located 150 miles away from the dry lake bed, is nevertheless severely affected by this airborne wind dust pollution. And I've even heard that folks in Los Angeles, more than 200 miles to the north, have experienced this dust pollution. All of this dust is what scientists classify as particulate matter size 10, or PM10 for short. PM10 is a federally regulated air pollutant. It stands for particulate matter of 10 microns or less. And particles of this size are terrible for people, especially for young people, older people, and people with breathing problems. The particles are small and they literally fill up the lungs, making it hard for anyone to get oxygen in. So the federal government regulates this very strictly. The federal standard is 150 micrograms per cubic meter. At times, Owens Lake had 20,000 micrograms per cubic meter. That's about 130 times the federal standard. And that meant for a very long time, Owens Lake enjoyed the dubious distinction of being the largest emitter of PM10 pollution in the United States. So clearly, something has to be done. What happens when an entity violates air pollution standards? Well, it gets a lot of attention from government agencies. You'd think the agencies I'm talking about are those that are responsible for regulating air pollution, agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency. And yes, they do get involved, but they weren't the first to insist on investigating and responding to the dust storms on Owens Lake. No, the agency pushing for all of that was, surprisingly, the Department of Defense. Because you see, China Lake Naval Weapons Center is about 60 miles south of Owens Lake. China Lake is where the Navy and Marine Corps have tested nearly every significant airborne weapon system over the past 5 decades. Except guess what? To test airborne systems, you need to be able to fly. And to fly, you need clean air. It's not so easy to achieve with the massive dust storms that were coming up over Owens Lake. So largely due to this pressure from the Department of Defense, there was a dry lake task force that formed on August 23rd, 1979, to begin addressing this problem. So members of this task force represent a wide array of interests and commitments, including government entities such as Inyo County and the City of Los Angeles. It includes private entities, such as the Lake Minerals Corporation, which extracts minerals from the lake bed. And it also includes public members, including residents of surrounding towns and cities. The task force pushed for and got tests that proved that the lake was out of compliance with federal pollution standards. And I want to just pause and mark this finding, because it shows how integral science is to identifying and naming the problem. For many residents of the valley, it's inconceivable that agencies and local governments didn't act sooner. To them, the problem was self-evident. They could see it, they could feel it, they could even taste it. But agencies wouldn't or couldn't act until there was some kind of concrete scientific proof. And I want you to know that that proof wasn't given until we had many stakeholders get together and make a concerted effort to develop it. And even then, it took years for governments to respond. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency only got involved in 1987, nearly 10 years after the formation of the Owens Lake Dry Lake Task Force. And because of the way the regulation works under the Clean Air Act, the primary responsibility for dealing with the air pollution didn't go to the EPA, but rather to a state agency known as the Great Basin Unified Air Pollution Control District. And I tell you this because I think it's really important to recognize that what we often think of as a water problem, a massive lake bed drying up, has become a massive air pollution problem. And as I'm going to talk about in just a bit, how we conceptualize this problem and how fundamentally we consider it is going to impact the kinds of solutions that we can imagine for it, what we come up with to address it. I also want to mention this because I want to highlight the very important fact that even though it's federal laws that are being violated, the burden for solving the problem is very often going to fall to the states, particularly in the area of air pollution. So the Great Basin Unified Air Pollution Control District really became the one who had to deal with Owens Lake. And their first job was to find someone responsible for the problem and make them bring it under control. So they did. They concluded that the responsible party was the city of Los Angeles, and more specifically, its public utility, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the ones that come in and divert all that water into the aqueduct. In 1997, the Great Basin Air Pollution Control District entered into an agreement with Los Angeles. It says, these are all the things that you need to do to come into compliance with the laws. Basically, it told LA, you need to stop the lake bed dust from getting into the air. And you would think that would solve the problem. Of course, the best way to tamp down dust is to put water on the ground. But as you can imagine, it's not a particularly appealing solution, especially in a state where water truly is liquid gold. So the mandate to keep dust down has resulted in a lot of conflict. Great Basin Unified Air Pollution Control District says you got to keep it down, and Los Angeles says we don't want to put water on the lake where it's basically going to become unusable. Folks in the Owens Valley like to joke that Owens Lake is best known as a full employment source for attorneys in Los Angeles and Sacramento. And I could spend the entire hour, or the entire day probably, detailing the legal history, and probably still only scratch the surface of those legal battles. To give you an idea of just how much litigation this has entailed, I'll tell you that just between 2011 and 2014, there were 12 lawsuits and appeals filed. Note I said 2011 and 2014. We had started negotiating this in 1997. This is dragging on a very long time. But for the most part, hopefully, we believe that most of this litigation has ended in 2014, when LA and the Great Basin Air Pollution Control District signed what everybody calls a historic settlement agreement, in which Los Angeles says we'll continue to mitigate the dust, and Great Basin says, okay, we're going to let you try to do things that don't take as much water, even though we know that this is going to be a little bit of trial and error, and we're going to have some events that are out of compliance. And those mitigation measures have resulted in some really innovative solutions. Now, the first might be what's the most obvious, which is shallow flooding, which is a version of putting water on the lake but not inundating it, just enough to keep the surface wet and make it into mud, because mud doesn't allow dust to blow. The second is managed vegetation, which means that if there's sufficient vegetation on the surface, the dust isn't going to blow. It's basically the same practice farmers use when they keep stubble in their fields to protect those fields from wind erosion. The third method is a gravel blanket, and that would be fairly permanent. It's also fairly expensive. A fourth and more recent method is tilling the lake bed. And this method basically roughens up the surface of the dirt, which is going to improve resistance to the wind and also create traps to catch windblown particles. Sometimes the dust techniques work double duty. So for example, LA has been experimenting with brine pools. In these areas, about 3/4 of the surface are covered with a salt crust, which saturates the surfaces. This crust forms and seals the surface to reduce dust emissions. It also provides food for migratory birds, which is really important because Owens Lake, like the Great Salt Lake, is a key stopover point for thousands of birds. It's been designated as a nationally significant important bird area by the Audubon Society. So LA has tried some other things as well. It's tried installing solar panels, which would provide an alternative energy source for the valley and ostensibly hold down the dust. They even put in an art installation, which they hope would pack down the dust, but perhaps more importantly, also has the added benefit of attracting interest and investment to the area. None of these measures have been wholly successful. And if we had more time, a lot more could and should be said about these various techniques. But for our purposes, I just want to say there's a lot that's been tried, and I think that there's a lot that can be learned about what's worked and why. And eventually, the dust settles down. The entire dilemma has been extraordinarily costly for Los Angeles. They've paid more than $1 billion in fines for noncompliance. They've paid more than $1 billion in dust control mitigation measures. What I think is a really important question, particularly for this audience, is why all of this dragged on for so long. And there are a couple of responses to this. First, it's a huge undertaking. The dust control effort covers an area roughly the size of San Francisco. Keeping that area damp requires more than 4,000 miles of pipeline alone. Second, here's the thing with air pollution. You're either in compliance or you're not. A very small source may only have a couple of tons of emissions, but it can still cause an air quality violation. So in some ways, this has been dragged on because perfection is unattainable, and even a slight imperfection can result in noncompliance. Third, decisions and policies can be made at a very high level, very abstract, but the implementation is done by people. And I think just about everyone involved in the Owens Lake dust remediation will tell you that the people involved, especially the people involved at the beginning, had very strong personalities and quite often made things very personal. Fourth, no method is perfect, and by far the most effective method has been shallow flooding, but that's going to require water. So there's a real tension between doing what works and saving water. And this is where the problems of water and air really come together, because LA doesn't want to take the water and dump it on the lake. It wants to keep that water flowing to the city of Los Angeles. So as drought years pile up, there's a lot of pressure on them, competing pressures from the Owens Valley to keep the dust down, but pressures from Los Angeles to keep the water flowing. So sometimes LA has to choose between water and air. And that contest between water and air is indicative of a bigger picture issue, which is that there are a lot of competing pressures on Los Angeles, a lot of competing pressures on all the entities that are responsible for remediating the lake. There are a lot of quote-unquote right answers, and there are a lot of quote-unquote wrong ones. Whether it's right or wrong depends on the perspective of the person who's judging it. There are lots of stakeholders with interest in Owens Lake, and the same answer can be right for some of them and wrong for others. So let me give you just one example. So remember, I mentioned the gravel control method of dust control. It's really effective. In fact, it was approved by the EPA as a dust control measure. It doesn't use water. It's expensive, but it's mostly an upfront expense. In that sense, it seemed to be very much the right answer for solving this dust problem in Owens Lake. But remember that Owens Lake has tremendous value for the indigenous Paiute and Shoshone people. And the lake bed holds ancient campsites and ancient burial sites. Most of those remain unidentified and unexplored. Burying those sites under gravel would make them unfindable, inaccessible, and in the eyes of many would desecrate sacred ground. So while gravel was very much the right answer for some stakeholders, it was not the right answer for others, and that's the primary reason that this method was not adopted. It's just one of the many examples I might provide about the competing interests shaping responses to the problems on Owens Lake. And it has, in my experience, been among the most difficult to resolve, bringing together these competing interests and finding compromises. But I don't want to just dwell on the problems. I want to talk through what lessons might be learned from the difficulties experienced on Owens Lake. Hopefully, I want to give you some insight and some things to think about as you're planning for the future of the Great Salt Lake. So the first lesson we can draw from this is that responsibility needs to be shared. In many ways, Owens Valley was lucky. Great Basin identified just one responsible party, and that party happened to have very deep pockets. The Owens Lake story would have ended up differently if Great Basin hadn't said, we know who's responsible, and that person can pay. It's a really different story if you look at other lakes that are suffering from similar issues. For example, the Salton Sea, also in California. It's California's most polluted inland lake. It's lost a third of its water in the last 25 years. In the case of the Salton Sea, it's much harder to identify one responsible party because the problem is really due to decades of irrigation, rapid evaporation sped by climate change, and depletion of the water from the Colorado River by no fewer than 7 states. In those kinds of cases, collaboration is absolutely crucial. If you can't easily identify one responsible actor, it really becomes key to think about who has a stake, what incentives exist for collaboration among those stakeholders, and what structures can be put in place to ensure that collaboration proceeds. And keep in mind, even though we've been able to say there's one responsible party for Owens Lake, it doesn't mean that people don't still point fingers. So even on Owens Lake, it's necessary to adopt a collaborative approach that brings together a lot of stakeholders. Because even when DWP is making the decisions, it needs to get buy-in from lots of different people in order to proceed with plans that benefit it and the lake. And that really takes us to the second lesson, which is that it's critical to identify and involve stakeholders and to implement structures that enable them to collaborate effectively. The Owens Valley is not large, but even in that small area, there are a tremendous number of interests, ranging from protection of cultural heritage, to protection of migratory birds, to protection of public health. There's also a lot of animosity and distrust that's accumulated through years and years of an us versus them mentality. And I think many people in the Owens Valley would say that progress was impossible on the lake until they create a forum in which stakeholders can meet and dialogue. They do this now about once a month, and they invite everybody with an interest, including representatives from the Department of Water and Power, the Audubon Society, the Owens Valley Committee, tribal governments, State Lands Commission, other government and public entities. I'm not going to paint an overly rosy picture. It doesn't get rid of conflict. But it does allow people to come together to speak about controversial issues, to make them transparent, and to make sure that their voices are heard by all the decision makers that are charged with making decisions. And so as we talk about this variety of interests, I want to bring up a third lesson from Owens Lake. And that is that legal structures and rules matter not just in litigation, but also in the establishment of rules and procedures outside of courts. There are layers of jurisdiction on Owens Lake. So the Great Basin Air Pollution Control District has jurisdiction over what happens in the air. The State Lands Commission regulates the lake bed as a matter of public trust. California Fish and Wildlife has an interest in the rivers that feed into Owens Lake. The Bureau of Land Management controls some of the external areas. And tribal governments have rights under federal law, including the Graves and Repatriation Act. What this means is that even if stakeholders agree to certain procedures, it's a pretty complicated process and requires navigating multiple agencies' rules and procedures. Fortunately for the lawyers, it likely means that they're not out of work even in times of relative peace. A fourth lesson is that in coming up with solutions, it's good to get creative. So as I mentioned, DWP has experimented with dust control through solar panels, which would be an alternative energy source for the valley. It wasn't entirely successful in holding down the dust. It caused a lot of controversy because of how it obstructed the views, but it was an attempt to do something a little bit creative and different. Sometimes the creative efforts are quite literal, as in the case with the art installation on Owens Lake. The art helps hold down the dust a little bit, but it also is going to bring in the interest and the investment that the valley needs to continue investing in the lake. And finally, I want to remind everyone that the most immediate problems aren't the only ones that are going to require planning. So as Los Angeles finally appears to be getting the dust under control on Owens Lake, it's confronted by another issue, which quite literally has been percolating for years, and that's groundwater. It's a great source of natural moisture for the lake. It's been used for dust control. That use also depletes groundwater supplies, which is an increasingly controversial issue in California as it's grappling with how to manage its groundwater. And I'll say until recently, those working on Owens Lake have not spent a lot of time thinking about groundwater. And as a result, plans for addressing that problem are behind where they need to be. So the lesson we can draw from that is to remember that there are myriad issues caused by a disappearing lake. It's important to consider all of them and to remember that they work in interaction with each other. As I wrap up this talk, I want to return to the story of the 1874 earthquake and the lesson we learned more than a century ago. Owens Lake is subject to change. Sometimes it's subject to change in a great, big hurry. It's important to address the problems of a disappearing lake as a dynamic process, to have procedures in place for monitoring and responding to change, sometimes change that happens within days or even hours. I want to emphasize that plans that work today aren't necessarily going to be the best plans for tomorrow. And so as we're looking for leaders and we're looking for new rules and new structures to deal with this new era of disappearing lakes, we need to keep in mind that we need not only science and technology, but also laws that require and make possible effective and timely responses to impending catastrophes. I want to conclude just by thanking the University of Utah for the invite. I want to thank all of you for taking this opportunity to look backward at Owens Lake in order to enable a clearer view of the future for the Great Salt Lake. I hope that Utah doesn't confront the kinds of catastrophes that California has been dealing with for decades. And based on what I've heard and seen during this symposium, I have a lot of hope that it's not going to come to that your efforts, your creativity, your collaboration will stave off these problems before they come to pass. Thank you.
Alyse, thank you very much for that presentation. We have a couple questions for you, so I'm not going to let you leave the podium quite yet. One question asks how much agriculture is around the Owens River today?
Not very much. When Los Angeles came in and bought up a lot of the land, what ended up was a lot of people left. And so comparatively, there's not a ton of agriculture. We still have farms. The primary agriculture is actually raising cows for beef. And so there's still some ranches there, but the agriculture is not significant. And not surprising because the conflicts over water are so great and the water is so minimal. And because Los Angeles really does control so much of the water that would have been used for irrigation in that area.
Is some of the water still available for agriculture in the area?
Yeah, so Inyo County has agreements in place with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. They're always being argued over and open to negotiation, where a certain amount is allowed for the valley. And you can imagine, certainly in times of water scarcity, it becomes really complicated because Los Angeles wants to maintain a certain amount for the aqueduct, but they still have to fulfill obligations to the county. So a little bit is still available for agriculture. They haven't taken all of the water, but such a significant amount that agriculture is really not sustainable.
Is there an end to the management of Owens Lake? It seems like this struggle to mitigate the dust is going to be ongoing into perpetuity.
That's the billion-dollar question. I think everybody hopes that there will be an end, but for now, I don't see a clear end in sight. I think what they're hoping for is that it's not going to be a less costly end. That's going to be more of a let's maintain what we've put in place, but they're still responsible for controlling the dust, and it requires a tremendous amount of work and effort. There's an entire small city that spreads out around Owens Lake, which is populated by Los Angeles Department of Water and Power personnel who live there and work there year-round on the lake, and I think that they will be there continually.
So in Marianne Wiggins' novel about Owens Valley, Properties of Thirst, are you familiar with that? Okay, good. The main character tries to blow up the aqueduct. Did anything like this really happen?
It did indeed. This is a real life story. The stories that come out of Owens Valley are the subject. I mean, it's not just a full employment source for attorneys, but for authors and filmmakers. Those of you who are familiar with Chinatown, that comes out of the Owens Valley story. It's just full of all sorts of stories that sometimes you think this has to be fiction, but is in fact true.
It is true. Okay. Were the tribes invited to participate in a group that was tasked with addressing the Owens Lake particulate pollution problem?
The tribes have been participating. They are in the group the forum that I talked about that brings together all the stakeholders. There's some complications because some of the issues that the tribes face have to do with information, particularly about location of sacred sites or human remains that they don't want to have made public. And so sometimes the tribes work separately with the governmental entities, but they are part of this ongoing task force that's tasked with kind of managing Owens Lake as a collaborative effort and bringing in as many stakeholders as possible.
You mentioned the need for leaders to move the ball forward. Who've been the key leaders in solving Owens Lake's problems, and how did they manage to create steps forward?
You know, I will say, this is why I keep harping on this idea of collaboration, because I see the leaders as not the government officials and not these state agencies, but really the people who have stakes in this particular lake, in this particular area, and have come forward and have said, we want you to know that these are our interests, and we want our interests to be heard, and we're willing to speak up for them. We are also willing to listen to other people's interests and to think about how our interests can coexist and work with those. So I think that the leaders are not necessarily the elected officials, but the people who really live with this problem, are aware of what effects it has and how detrimental that is to their livelihoods, their health, and insist on making sure that those perspectives are part of the process and are taken into consideration as people are thinking about ways in which they can remediate the dust.
I think you mentioned this, but let's clarify it. Does Owens Lake struggle with toxic dust laced with arsenic and other heavy metals that's similar to some of the challenges that we face here with the Great Salt Lake? Absolutely.
It is incredibly toxic. And I think that this is why air pollution standards are as strict as they are, because a small amount is still extremely toxic. And so this is why it's so problematic anytime there's an incident where they're out of compliance with air pollution control standards.
In Utah, stakeholder groups often leave out some community stakeholders. How do you recommend getting grassroots community involvement in the stakeholder processes?
It's a really good question, and I think it comes. The answer is coming from both sides, which is we need to create forums in which those groups are welcome and know that they're welcome, which means providing not just invitations, but invitations that are sure to reach grassroots groups. Make sure that they have information about when opportunities to present their views are being held, being heard, and making sure those meetings are heard at a time where they can participate. And I think it's also up to those groups to be willing to come into the process and participate. And I think sometimes that's harder. Like I said, especially in Owens Lake, I've seen there's a lot of distrust that's formed, and it can be very difficult to say, I want to be part of this process that has disregarded me for so long. But I think to move forward, there has to be that willingness on both sides.
Has the Department of Water and Power stopped ground pumping water from Owens Valley?
No.
That was an easy question to answer. Do you realistically think an intervention will be made? This is jumping around on me, excuse me. An intervention will be made unless direct consequences start to affect the valley and Owens Lake.
Well, I will say direct consequences have been affecting the valley and Owens Lake, and I think that dates all the way back to 1979, the formation of that Dry Lake Task Force, and that when we started to have testing and see that this was violating air pollution standards. And so, as I said kind of in the talk, I don't know that intervention would have happened without that proof that this is something that's illegal, that this is something that we can scientifically prove. But in the case of Owens Lake, that question is very clearly answered with a yes. There are direct consequences, and those consequences violate laws, and they can be shown scientifically.
And a final question, what are the health effects of the drying of Owens Lake for local residents?
Terrible. The incidence of asthma is sky high. People have a hard time when there's kind of dust incidents. They can't go outside. There's been tremendous problems. Some people have respiratory illnesses. They're particularly affected by all of these things that are happening that target people with respiratory illnesses. And the public health concerns are serious and real and still affect residents of Owens Valley, and not just Owens Valley, but these surrounding areas, including Ridgecrest and further away to this day.
With that, let me thank you for this very enlightening presentation. Give us a basis for comparison to the challenges that we're facing. And please join me in thanking Alyse for this. Our next speaker may need little introduction to this audience, but I will provide an introduction. We're very pleased to have a recovering attorney present here in the moot court room at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. That's part of Governor Spencer Cox's description. He's also a husband, a father, a farmer, and most importantly, he's our 18th governor here in the state of Utah. He took office on January 4th, 2021. Since taking office, he's secured funds for affordable housing. He's promoted suicide prevention and mental health resources and implemented, most importantly for our purposes today, water conservation and infrastructure planning. He's also made contributions in early education, workforce program funding, and he's launched the Utah Sustainable Health Collaborative and expanded opportunities for women, diverse communities, and those living in the rural parts of the state. He's promoted the concept of a One Utah vision. The governor is a sixth-generation Utahn. He was born and raised in Fairview. He met his wife, First Lady Abby Palmer Cox, at the age of 16. He attended Snow College, Utah State University, and the Washington and Lee University Law School, after which he clerked for U.S. District Court Judge Ted Stewart. He also worked at a Salt Lake City law firm. He then moved back to Fairview to raise his 4 children. He began his public life as a city councilman, a mayor, county commissioner, a state legislator, before being appointed to serve as Utah's lieutenant governor in 2013, and then now serving as our 18th governor. Governor Cox, we're very pleased to welcome you here today. Look forward to your comments. If I understand correctly, you'll be available to take some questions up until we're finished at quarter after. So thank you very much for joining us.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to be here with you today on a beautiful spring-ish day. It's great to be here in this building and to see so many incredible partners that are working on this critical issue. I want to thank the university for their leadership when it comes to water conservation and specifically the Great Salt Lake. And I have no idea what I'm going to say today. You've had a busy day already, an incredible agenda with many people who are smarter than I am when it comes to the science around the lake. You also have a full agenda today, in which you will be hearing from the Speaker of the House, Brad Wilson, a dear friend, a great public servant, and an incredible partner when it comes to efforts around the Great Salt Lake. Now, Brad and I do this. Is Brad here yet? I don't think he is here yet. Brad and I do this thing where we go places and we speak to people, and we often speak about what has happened policy-wise in the state. Of course, that's why we're here. And I usually get to go first, which means that I say all the things that he is going to say as well. And the last thing you need today is to hear the same thing multiple times, although there's probably been a little bit of that. And so as I was preparing last night and this morning, I thought maybe I would go a little different direction than the amazing talking points that I have here in front of me. And I'm going to do something that will probably offend many of you, but that's okay. I'm going to governor-splain just a little bit about what we do and why we do it and how to do it better. If any of you read the book Think Again, it's a great book. It's one I recommend people. In fact, for those of you that have read it, I will tell you that every year I gift a book to the legislature, to all 104 members of the legislature, with the hopes that they will read something, and that it will be something that I recommend, and that it will be something that makes them better. And this year I gave them the book Think Again. It's a small book. It's been a couple years actually since I read it, so I need to read it again as well. But the idea behind it is he's trying to get people. He says basically there's three ways of thinking through problems. You can think like an evangelist, a pastor, a preacher, and that is, I know I'm right, God is on my side, and the other side is wrong. He talks about how that's not a great way to persuade people, okay? He says you can think like a politician, which is, kind of he talks about a politician. He talks about a prosecutor even more, and that is, if we have some attorneys, again, I'm a recovering attorney, the prosecutor is, it doesn't matter what the facts are. I have to get the facts on my side right. And many politicians are thinking more like prosecutors these days, right? It's my tribe. I'm right. Even when I know I'm wrong, I can never admit that. I've got to hold the other side accountable and make them pay. And that's what prosecutors do, right? They present the facts in the best light for their case. That's what attorneys are trained to do. We always said, if the facts are on your side, argue the facts. If the law is on your side, argue the law. And if neither are on your side, just argue like hell. That's what prosecutors do. All right. And that's, so there's that side of thing. And then he talks about scientists. And his effort here is to convince more people to think like scientists. Scientists are curious. Scientists recognize that they might be wrong. Scientists are willing to engage with thoughts that are different than theirs to challenge their previously held assumption. At least the good scientists do this. and we have many scientists here today. There is a peer review process that scientists go through, right, where they have to open themselves up to challenges from other people who are also very smart. And his main point is, think how different our world would be if all of us, especially politicians, thought more like scientists. Right? If we were a little more curious, less willing to admit when we're wrong, willing to be challenged, willing to take other ideas and carry them with us, and then see if our ideas hold up to that. I believe we do have some politicians like that. I try to be one. I don't always get it right. Sometimes I'm wrong, and sometimes I get a little dogmatic myself, and a little more combative than I should be. Now. So why am I sharing all of this? Well, I also, though, want to push back just a little bit on the thinking like scientist realm of things. And I think there are some lessons that we learned during the pandemic. Scientists actually are not good at convincing non-scientists about things. And we certainly saw that, I think, during the pandemic. One of the reasons is that scientists are just inherently smarter than the rest of us, because you are experts. You do know more than we know. And I'm using we as politicians and just average members of the public, okay? And sometimes where scientists see nuance and humility and a lack of surety, because scientists are highly intelligent, especially in their area of expertise, there is often an unwillingness to share that nuance with the public. And so we're afraid that average people aren't smart enough to know what we know. And so we just have to tell them the parts that they can understand or should know, and we make it seem like we're much more sure of it maybe than the actual scientist is, in an effort to bring them along. Now, I believe we saw this behavior during the pandemic. I think we saw it often. I would have conversations with experts in the field who would, to me, admit nuance. This is what we think, but we're not sure. And then their messages to the public were, this is true. You cannot question it or challenge it, and this is the only way. And what would happen is oftentimes the surety was maybe 60-40 in their own minds, but they were selling it or explaining it as 100% surety. And then if it turned out not to be true, there was a lack of trust. And you will hear me, my staff is tired of me, but speaking about trust, to me, trust is the currency of governing. Trust is the currency of society. It's the currency of community, and we are losing trust in institutions. We lost trust in political institutions a long time ago, although that is continuing to erode. We are rapidly losing trust in scientific institutions and community institutions. And I think that phenomenon that I just mentioned is sometimes at the core of why we're losing that trust. Now, politicians are famous for exacerbating that trust in ways that benefit them but are destructive to society. And I know you can all think of many examples of politicians who have used fear and divisiveness, and who will take a partial truth and or a partial mistruth and exploit it for their own benefit, which is decidedly harmful and destructive. I will say this, there are a couple things that we saw during the pandemic that were very helpful. I wish that every scientific department would embed a social scientist with them in what they're doing. People that understand human nature, not just the nature of a virus or the nature of the Great Salt Lake or the nature of climate change. I think we need a lot more social scientists embedded with you, the scientific community, and with politicians as well. I will tell you that our pandemic response, and I had a front row seat for that, changed dramatically, I think in a very positive way, when we embedded someone who would become the president of the University of Utah. He was the dean of the business college at the time, but someone who understands human nature, who understands the economic nature of humans very well. And our approach to the pandemic, our public health approach to the pandemic got much better. And I believe the scientists would tell you this as well, because they've told me, and I don't think they were lying to me, Angela Dunn and others who were in those rooms, when then the dean of the business school here at this incredible university, Taylor Randall, was in the room with Angela Dunn, and they were having these conversations back and forth about how the messaging would be received and what the reactions would be, and helping her to understand how the economics of our state work and human nature in responding to things like this. The messages changed, they got better, and I believe our response was better because of it. Now, why do I share all of this? Over the past couple years especially, we've had a very robust and I think important, a critically important discussion about how to respond to growth in our state, and how to respond to changing climate in our state, and how to respond to a mega drought, a 20-year drought that has been impacting the Western United States. The scientists in the room look at the cold hard facts, at least the facts as we have them, in an effort to explain what is happening, why it's happening, and what will happen if conditions do not change. And that is a very important discussion. That's why all of you are here. And I'm grateful for it. My job is very different than that. My job, at least done appropriately, is to take that information and translate it into the language of the people of the state of Utah. I have a friend who's in marketing, and he says he says that the best companies translate the truth of them into the language of their customers or potential customers. And I believe that the best politicians are, again, able to translate the truth of them or the truth of what is happening into the language of our citizens in a way that will build trust. Because trust is really important, and understanding human nature is absolutely critical. There is, unfortunately, a growing divide, a political divide, that is infiltrating every level of society. In fact, I think it is now, sadly, the single most important definer of every institution. Is your institution a left-leaning institution or a right-leaning institution? Now, let me be clear. I do not think this is good or healthy, and I wish it were not so, and I hope we can change that over time. But for better or worse, this institution, the University of Utah in which we stand, is seen as a left-leaning institution in a right-leaning state. The scientific community on whole is seen as a very left-leaning institution, again, in a state that is very right-leaning. And that has the tendency to color everything we talk about. And it should not, but it does. And so, again, as a politician who is a right-leaning politician, politics is the only thing that should be divided on this scale, and has been since the beginning of time. But I believe, I will just add, I believe that we should stop looking at things on a right to left paradigm, because I think there is another axis on this paradigm that we should pay more attention to, just as an aside. Other people call it different things. I call it building and destroying, the builders and the destroyers. I think there are people on the far right and the people on the far left that are builders, that are really looking at ways to try to make things better and come together, and those are people we can work with. I think there are people on the far right and the far left, and even in the center, that are destroyers, that just want to, for their own purposes or whatever, tear people down and tear people apart and not fix problems. Okay, but let me now. I digress. Let me go back to my earlier point here. Helping translate, again, the truth of what is happening into the language of the people that we are working with. It is very easy in our society today to get ourselves into our own echo chambers. It's especially easy for politicians. We do this all the time because of social media and the way we communicate now. And there's so many different sources. Finding truth is harder than it has ever been before. But finding our own truth is easier than it has ever been before. And finding the truth that we like, that makes us feel comfortable, that matches our previously held assumptions about the world is so easy. It is easy for politicians on the right, and it is easy for scientists on the left. Okay? And so I submit to you today that your job is not to convince the people that love you as scientists, the people who are my neighbors in the avenues now, who have their Save the Great Salt Lake bumper stickers right next to the Save Bears Ears bumper stickers. You don't need to convince them. They are already there. But they're much easier, and you get lots of pats on the back when you say things that resonate with them. But that does not help move the conversation forward. Okay? We have to, again, understand the people of our state and the legislators of our state and how to accept truth, how to know what that truth is with all the exceptions and caveats that you understand. And it's okay to share those exceptions and caveats. Trust me, people can handle this. And admitting that you may not know everything and that you may be wrong and that you're only 60% sure or 75% sure or 80% sure will actually strengthen your argument. And if you happen to be wrong, that will be well received. And admitting when we're wrong actually builds trust. It violates Politics 101, I will tell you that. We're supposed to never admit when we're wrong. But I can tell you on those occasions, albeit probably more rare than you would like, when I admit that I am wrong, I can tell you immediately the trust factor goes up. It's very refreshing when that happens. Now, we also live in a time, and back to the social scientist piece of this, I believe that doom and gloom does not result in change. I believe it has never inspired change. And I think that is core to our human nature. When we tell people that the sky is falling, what most people do is they give up. They just think, well, there's nothing I can do about it. What can my one little thing, if the Great Salt Lake is already done, if it's already dried up and we're all gonna die from toxic dust, then I'm just gonna go ahead and water my lawn. Okay? I just am. That is just human nature. And it is not helpful. It is not helpful at all. Now, the other thing that is not helpful is when people do good things and people are making change, albeit marginal and small, to be critical of that change. If your reaction to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints donating a historic amount of water was, yeah, that's a drop in the bucket. They could do more. This is not really going to change anything. Then you have the wrong message. Okay? These are moments we should celebrate because in celebration, we inspire others to do and make change. Whether the change is small or big, we have to celebrate that change to bring people along. I would also encourage you not to mock people and their religious views. Whether you believe or don't, we do live in a state that is highly religious. When I asked the people of our state to join in faith and prayer in asking God to help relieve us of this terrible drought that we have been facing, I knew there would be pushback. I will tell you, I was a little shocked at the amount of pushback and mocking that was received. Because Governor Herbert did this a couple times during his term of governor and didn't receive the same kind of vitriol and pushback. But here's why I think that really matters. I feel like I know the people. This is one thing. Politicians do tend to be much more in tune with the people that they represent than scientists do, because we interact with them daily. We hear from them daily. We saw shortly after asking people to pray, we did not see an immediate influx of rain and snow. Okay? I admit that. But I will tell you what we did see. We saw people of faith and people not of faith immediately start using much less water. The conservation that took place in our state over the past 2 summers far exceeded my highest expectations. When we ask people to pray, what I believe and what I understand is people that are praying for more water will use less water. I just absolutely firmly believe that. And I believe that has been proven out. We've seen it over and over and over again. And as I saw people of all faiths, I received letters from our Jewish congregations, our Muslim congregations who held a day of fasting and prayer for water. They and their congregants were also asked to use less water, and they did. Understanding human nature will help us make the changes we need to make. Lastly, and then we'll open it up for questions, the human nature of our legislature. And I want to thank the Speaker of the House for his wisdom. Last year, not this session that we just finished, the session before, we had about a dozen very important water conservation policy bills. And they were not moving at all. And we were just struggling. We just couldn't get them to go across the finish line. And the Speaker said, hey, I have a favor. Can we borrow a couple of Black Hawk helicopters? And I'm like, please tell me why. And he said, well, I want to take our legislators out over the Great Salt Lake. Now, turns out human nature, he understood this with his people. Everyone likes to ride in Black Hawk helicopters. If you invite them to come for a ride in a Black Hawk helicopter, they all showed up. And you laugh, but you would too. So legislators, they got in helicopters, they flew out over the Great Salt Lake, and in less than a week, all 12 bills had passed. Now, they had seen pictures of the Great Salt Lake. They had seen detailed maps of the Great Salt Lake. They had seen aerial footage of the Great Salt Lake. They did not see anything on that flight that they had not seen themselves many, many times. And so, what changed? Well, I firmly believe that in the policy of show, don't tell. We can preach a lot, but if we can show, if we can bring people along with us, give them opportunities to participate, to be part of the solution, it will change their mindset and they will do more. Now, I'm very proud of what the legislature has accomplished over the past 2 sessions. And we should take those victories because incremental change is the only way to get change. Paradigm change takes time. How many of you, I remember growing up, we took a trip to Florida, my entire family, as a kid in the 80s, okay, in a van. We did not know that van had seatbelts in it. We drove all the way to Florida without seatbelts. How many of you, as a kid, never wore a seatbelt? Yeah. How many of you now don't have your kids or grandkids wear seatbelts? You scratched your head. I know you didn't mean to say that. Yeah, okay. Right, paradigm shifts, right? It happened, but it didn't happen overnight. It took time. This paradigm shift is happening incredibly rapidly. But there is an uncomfortableness in human nature when change happens too fast. Okay? And I think that's critically important. We are going faster than I ever thought we would go. But if we start confiscating farms and water shares, what you will see happen is you will see politicians respond very quickly. People will run for office to make sure that we are not saving the Great Salt Lake, and they will be elected. And those are the types of things that you have to think through when we're having these conversations. This legislature is moving. I thought it would take us 5 or 6 years to get a couple of these big bills that change 150 years of water policy in this state. This use it or lose it mentality that we have had from the very beginning, not mentality, but legal structure that we have had, has finally changed. That is worthy of huge celebrations. $1 billion in 2 years in water investment in this state. I never thought in my lifetime we would see that kind of an investment from a legislature. And you know what the legislature hears from the left and from the scientific community? What is wrong with you guys? You aren't doing nearly enough. And human nature is, you know what? Screw you guys. If you don't want our help, we're done. We're out. That's what we can't allow to happen. Okay? Now, I'm not saying you can't be critical. You should be critical, right? But I would say be cautious with your criticism. And when we get victories, celebrate those with us, right? Don't treat them as your enemy. Treat them as your allies, and they will be. Now, I've talked too long. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I governor-splained. We love you. We are going to save the Great Salt Lake. I promise you we are going to save the Great Salt Lake. Legislative leadership and the executive branch are committed to this. This is our top priority. This is it. We're not faking it. This isn't something just to satisfy a portion of our constituents. It is not that. Everywhere I go, this is the question I get. What are we doing to save the Great Salt Lake? That is a paradigm shift. It is being translated into the language of the people of Utah, and they are responding. So let's not lose that momentum. That's all I ask. I have time for 2 questions. Questions?
Governor Cox, thank you very much. Is this on? Everybody
It is.
Hearing? Okay. We very much appreciate your thoughts on this, and I'll ask you the tough question.
Yes.
That a number of people approved asking, if I can put it that way, and that is, should the state set a state goal to raise the lake level to the minimum of a widely accepted healthy range as recommended by some of the, or proposed at least as a possible solution by the strike team and some of the other science groups that have looked at the problem?
Yeah, sure. Yes. Yeah, sure. But I'm also going to say this. There are policy things that matter and there are policy things that don't matter. This is a policy thing that doesn't change anything. I know what the average lake level is. I know exactly what it is. I see that number every single day. We can adopt it, sure. There was a legislator who ran a resolution, a non-binding resolution, to set that. It didn't pass. I don't care. It's fine. Whatever. I just see these are the things. Like these are the things we get caught up on. Like everybody's mad that resolution didn't pass, and that resolution does absolutely nothing. It does absolutely nothing. It's great. I mean, the average lake level for the last 120 years is set. I have a graph that I look at every single day that shows that average lake level. I'm doing everything I can to get that back up there. The other thing that is really interesting, the lake has never been at that average lake level. It never is. Go look at it. Look at the line that draws through. All it is this, right? It might be there for a couple days every 8 years, but this is what the lake does. Now it's doing this, which is the problem, right? So yes, my goal, I will sleep much better once we hit that average. Okay? If we want to set that as a goal, yes, sure, great. Whatever. It's my goal. It's everybody's goal. We want to get it there. So yes, and that will do absolutely nothing to get more water to the lake.
You spoke of trust. What are you doing and what are you planning to do in the governor's office to gain trust when it comes to leadership and management of the Great Salt Lake?
So there's a couple things that we're doing that I think are really important. One is just messaging. Messaging really matters. There is a reason that the year before last, I held my budget announcement on the shores of the Great Salt Lake. Now, let me be clear. I just criticize things that won't add water to the lake. Me standing in front of the Great Salt Lake to announce my budget will do nothing to get water to the Great Salt Lake. I admit that. But again, what I'm trying to do is to share that visual with 3.3 million people who may not see it every day, right? So again, helping people to understand what the scope of the problem is and that there is something that they can do about it. So one of the things is government has to be better at this. right? We have to set an example. And that's what we're trying to do with our state facilities. We're trying to upgrade our state facilities. We're removing turf, unnecessary and unused turf. We're trying to really change the way we do things here so that we can model good behavior. I think that's really important. The other piece of this is a piece of legislation that just passed. It is so important. And again, that I don't think got enough attention. This one will do a lot more than setting some whatever level for the lake. And that is a new commissioner to oversee the lake with extraordinary powers that we don't usually give to people. This person that once this bill goes into effect in May will be appointing this person with approval from the Senate, will have the ability to work with and even override other departments and agencies. We have so many people working on the Great Salt Lake, but nobody is tasked with making sure that the water gets to the end of the row. Right? So we're saving water here, but is it really getting where it's supposed to go? That's what this position will do. And I think this will change trust more than anything else, that we have a single person who will report directly to me to make sure that our combined efforts are making a difference. And then we can hold people accountable. We hold this person accountable who reports directly to the governor of the state of Utah. And if it's not happening, then you vote for a new governor. And that's where accountability should be held. And I really believe that this will make a huge difference. And I think we are out of time, and I don't want to keep the next speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, I didn't say this enough. And I hope you don't feel like I'm being critical of you. That was not my intention. I want to thank you. I want us to be more like you. I want us to be curious. I want us to solve problems working together. And we can't do that without good information and good data. And you are giving us that information and that data. I will just say to conclude, we are having an incredible water year, right? A historic water year. Right now, the other graph I look at every single day, that black line is above the purple lines. It's never been that high since we started tracking. We today are in record territory when it comes to snow water equivalent in our mountains. That is something to be celebrated. Celebrated, okay? And let me just say that nobody in leadership thinks, oh, well, now we don't have to do anything. Now we have a reprieve. I know you're all worried about that. Well, we can't tell them the truth because, yes, it's a great year, but if they think it's a great year, then they'll stop trying. Like, that's the kind of mindset that gets it backwards. We celebrate having a record year, and that means more water to get into the lake. This isn't a time to pause. This isn't a time to stop. It's a time to accelerate the changes that we've already made because we can capture more of that water. Nobody's stopping, nobody's pausing, nobody's giving up. We're with you. We're on the same team. God bless you. Thank you.
So we are not finished with the political side of the Great Salt Lake issue. We're very pleased to have with us this morning, following the governor, but also assuming a leadership role himself as the Speaker of the Utah House, and that is Brad Wilson. He's represented Utah's 5th House District for over a decade. He currently serves as the Speaker. It's a position he's held since 2019. During his service in the legislature, he's championed policies to make Utah one of the strongest, best managed, and most business-friendly states. As Utah has faced prolonged drought, Speaker Wilson has championed the effort to protect Utah's natural infrastructure by preserving and restoring the Great Salt Lake. Under his leadership, the House has advanced policies to conserve, preserve, and optimize Utah's water supply. When he's not in the House, Speaker Wilson can be found hiking in the mountains with his family or on their boat. And he lives in Kaysville, and we're very pleased to have the Speaker with us today. Speaker Wilson, thank you for joining us.
Hey, good morning. It's great to be with you all today. And this is a high-tech operation we've got going here, and they needed some time to get it set up, I guess. But my name is Brad Wilson, and as was said, I'm the Speaker of the House. And let me first of all say, I know this isn't really a law school event, at least I don't think it is, but it's kind of wistful for me to be speaking in this building in the law school. My father, who passed away about 11 years ago, went to law school here at the University of Utah. And I'll talk about it in a minute, but a lot of my memories growing up were with my dad out, about, and in and around the Great Salt Lake. So it's kind of an interesting opportunity for me to be with you today. Let's get started. So extending well above 200 feet in the air and about 15 feet in diameter are the sequoia trees in California. And I think we all know that these are some of the tallest and the biggest and the most famous trees, and I would add beautiful trees in the world. And I think a lot of us would think that trees that are this huge would have this incredibly deep root system that go down deep, deep into the ground. But in fact, that is actually not the case. Sequoia trees are rooted relatively shallow, and they're buried no deeper than about 10 feet into the ground. And what's even more remarkable than that is that these trees over centuries have withstood earthquakes and floods and super strong winds and fires, of course, and other natural disasters, and they very, very rarely ever fall down. So you might say, well, how in the world could that be possible? Something that a single tree can weigh up to 500 tons and reach hundreds of feet into the sky. And we all know these trees live for centuries, right? They've been around a long, long time. And how can they do that with their roots only going at most 10 feet into the ground? Well, what's interesting is these amazing sequoia trees have an interconnected root system. These trees literally hold each other up by growing close together and intertwining their roots with one another. And what that means is only redwood trees have the ability to help and support other redwood trees. Similar to that is Utah's really vast and remarkable and complex intertwined water system. So I grew up in Kaysville and Layton. Most of my time was actually spent growing up in Layton. And I lived about a block away from a street called Antelope Drive, named after Antelope Island, because it goes straight down into the Great Salt Lake and into Antelope Island. And I already mentioned this, but growing up, we would spend a lot of time out on Antelope Island. I think we were one of those really weird Utah families that actually spent time playing in the Great Salt Lake. And spent a lot of time out there. And I have really fond memories of being with my dad and my family. And now today, I live in Kaysville. And every time I go home, every night, I drop off of a bluff out to get out to West Kaysville. And I can see what's left of the Great Salt Lake. And it's not as big as it used to be. A few years ago, about 2.5 years ago, actually, I was going for I'm not really a runner anymore, I'm more of a jogger, but I was going for a jog up on the East Bench of Kaysville, listening to some podcasts, and came across a podcast that started speaking about the Great Salt Lake, and was really startled with what I heard that morning. And this podcast talked about the shrinking Great Salt Lake and the potential risks and downfalls that as a state we needed to be mindful of. And as I literally looked into the distance at Antelope Island and the small amount of water that still surrounds it, I recognized that I'd taken for granted that the lake had always been there and always would be. And it really became clear to me how dire the situation was for our state and for this lake that I actually really, really love. So, to make a long story short, I got on the phone, called my chief of staff, talked to my team, and called some of the water experts that I knew and got their perspective. And we seriously started to dive into this issue. And I've learned several things over the last few years about this, but I will tell you one lesson really stands out to me. As we have worked to protect and preserve and save the Great Salt Lake, it has become clear to me that the Great Salt Lake is a symbol of a much broader and more systematic problem and challenge we have with the way we manage our water collectively in the state of Utah. And the Great Salt Lake, it's a big piece, but it's only a piece of a much larger water puzzle related to the Great Salt Lake. So you remember those sequoia trees in the redwood forest? I would imagine that their root system looks very similar to something like what you see up here. As you can see, all the reservoirs and the structures and the lakes and the creeks that run throughout our state, it's pretty remarkable. And if you really look at that map, if you can see it, I think you can, you'll notice that there's not a single source of water that is truly independent. Everything on that map is connected to something, whether it's another river or reservoir or tunnel or aqueduct or stream or something like that. And what this means for all of us is the Great Salt Lake is, and the challenge we have with the Great Salt Lake is not just a Great Salt Lake problem. It's not just a Wasatch Front problem, and it's not something for just northern Utah to be concerned about or to solve. So as such, we think about this, addressing the Great Salt Lake is a statewide effort. It's a statewide task. And our best efforts and our commitment and innovation and sacrifice to save the Great Salt Lake is actually needed for the greater needs of the state of Utah. As we know, I think we all know, the Great Salt Lake hit a record low just 6 months ago. Thanks to a wet winter, which the governor did a nice job talking about. Let me just pause by saying, we get the governor's budget recommendations every fall. And governors like to think they manage the state budget, but actually the legislature does. But the governor gave us his budget recommendations, and he was talking to me and he said, Speaker, I've put $5 million in the state budget for flood mitigation. And I'm like, have you lost your mind? And lo and behold, he was prophetic, and here we are. And the only problem we have is we probably should have put $50 million in the budget for flood mitigation this year. But thanks to this really great state wet winter, the statewide conservation efforts as well, the lake has risen a couple feet in a relatively short period of time from the low that we had last November. And we can expect that this trend in a significant way is going to continue upward as snow melt and runoff make its way to the Great Salt Lake. Though this is great news, we are still, and we will always be, one of the driest states in the nation. And we've got many people that are really aware that working on this problem is something that has been long past due, actually, and something that many people have worked on long before I started paying attention to it. And I am very, very grateful to those individuals that have. I'm equally grateful to the work that my colleagues in the legislature have done. They've come light years in a very short period of time in a bipartisan way to be thoughtful and mindful about the things that we need to do to have a commitment to the lake. And while I wish we weren't facing a drying lake, working on this issue has actually been a breath of fresh air. And what I mean by that is, in today's world of politics, it is a time of divisiveness, it's a time of disagreement, but in this case, everybody in the state is working towards a common goal. And we are interconnected with this same objective of saving the Great Salt Lake, and at the same time, bettering Utah's water system in general. Between the session in 2022 and the session we just concluded a few weeks ago, we have done more for Utah's water and to protect and preserve the Great Salt Lake than ever before in the history of our great state. So I want to take a quick look at some of those things that we have done, just to give you a sense of that. The first thing is, last year we invested $50 million in agricultural optimization so that our agriculture community can use less water and still get the great outcomes that they do. And this turns out to be probably our best return on investment in terms of taxpayer dollars. For every $1 that the taxpayer invests in this, the private sector, our agriculture community, puts $4 in. Let me just show you a quick video about this. So, am I supposed to? I don't see a button I'm supposed to push here. So,
there should be like a play button.
There's not a play button. Oh, there's a play button.
Ooh, I wouldn't have found it either.
It is not working. I don't think my videos are going to work. It doesn't look like. So, well, I will do this by song. I will sing what this video was supposed to tell you. But what you would see in this is we've got a number of innovative projects and farmers and ranchers across the state. They're implementing this agricultural optimization technology where for a lot less water, they can get better outcomes in their farms, and then there's less water that is used. We think on average, the implementation of agricultural optimization reduces our agriculture consumption by about 30%. So this last session that just concluded recently, we built upon that $50 million from last year and put another $200 million into agricultural optimization to expand the program that our Department of Agriculture and Food executes through grants requiring the agriculture community to implement these irrigation efficiency projects. I'll add to that local ordinances, our cities and our counties across the state also play a really important role in determining how much water we actually use. And my guess is the next video is not going to work either, but I will give it a try. Let's see if this works. This is...
So I can speak on behalf
maybe it
of
isn't gonna
Layton
work.
City.
We turn up
We've
the
done
volume?
several different things. We've changed our landscaping ordinance. We've added an app for our citizens to be able to see how much water consumption they've been using. We've got a GSI system to help our citizens understand their own vegetation and the different soils that they're trying to water and keep hydrated, as well as we've been working with Rocky Mountain Power on the pumps that we use within our aquifer and being able to get the water up so we can get it to our citizens. But the biggest thing that I am most proud about is our citizens. We've been able to inform them and educate them on all the different opportunities that we need them to do to step up to help conserve water.
So that was Mayor Joy Petro from Layton, actually my hometown, talking about the great work that Layton City has done, implementing new requirements for development across their city that are dramatically reducing the amount of water that growth in the state and their city is requiring. So this last year, not this session that just ended, but a year ago, the state legislature allocated over the last year, $250 million of funding to help install secondary water meters across the state so that each house, each neighborhood has a really good idea and clear understanding of how much water they're using and what they can do in terms of their part to help reduce water consumption. And again, we see whenever these meters get installed, consumption goes down by about 30%, so a significant amount. Let's take a look and see how these meters have helped make a difference.
Ph.D. 242 that was passed last year was a great boost to the entire secondary metering project statewide. It allowed for $250 million of funding to go towards secondary metering, which was a lot of small irrigation companies just really couldn't afford to take that step. We've seen a lot of support from a lot of the customers and customer agencies in providing those secondary meters. So it benefits really conservation as a whole, and it allows people to understand how they actually use water and to be accountable for the water that they do use.
So in addition to the $250 million we already put away in this, we put another $20 million into this program this year to kind of get a few other places across the finish line. And what's been really heartening about this is actually the implementation of the secondary water metering has happened much faster than we thought it might. So every effort to conserve water across the Wasatch Front is going to make a difference in terms of the lake. Water banking, which you've heard a little bit about, is a really creative and innovative solution that allows Utahns to use and share our precious water resources. I want to just show you a quick segment about how water banking is working across the state.
These are huge steps, generational type steps. But everybody knows that that's just the beginning, and we need to do more and more because it's just going to take a real big effort from a lot of people working together. It's hard to think of any long-term solution for Great Salt Lake that doesn't involve water banking. Water banking is an innovation that really allows us to share this precious resource of water. When you think about how a bank works, if you have money that you can get by without, you can put it into the bank, you get paid for it, and somebody else uses it. It's really the same idea when it comes to water. So if somebody can get by without a water right, or they can get by with less water, they can put it into the bank, and then other people can come and lease that water back out of the bank. So it's a great way to take this scarce resource that we have and to spread it out so that more people can use it. I think in the last few years, the real advances have been just testing this proof of concept. So we've put it under the ground. We're actually deploying water banks in different parts of the state. And so we're learning what works and what doesn't work and how we can make the system work even better.
So a lot of great things that are underway right now to help us conserve water. Over the last few years, it's become really obvious and clear to me, though, that we haven't really had the right system to look at and strategically manage the Great Salt Lake. I was driving home from the Capitol one night, probably mid to late December, and I get a lot of calls about the Great Salt Lake. I've done 2 Great Salt Lake summits, and whenever anyone has an idea about how to save the Great Salt Lake, somehow they end up on a phone call with me. And as Speaker of the House, I have spent more time on this singular issue than anything else over the last couple of years. But there's other parts of my job as well, and I'm not an expert on water. And I started thinking that what we really lack as a state around the Great Salt Lake is someone that owns the strategy and the execution of that strategy. And so I called the Capitol and said, let's do something about that. And over the last session, we did make a big difference. And the governor actually talked about this, but maybe before I get to that, I'm actually getting my videos out of order. Last year, we also ran a bill creating a water trust. And as Speaker, I don't run very many bills, but this is a bill that I ran that creates a trust that we partner with the Nature Conservancy and the Audubon Society to help manage the lake. And so let me, do I have a video? I don't have a video about that. I'm completely out of order here. No, I do have a video about that. So I think it says it's, do I have a video about this? Okay. It says play. So, okay, well, there we go. So we partner with the Audubon Society, and they're implementing that trust. You probably heard about the great work that our federal delegation is doing. Senator Romney and Representative Moore in particular have been sort of the tip of the spear at leading some efforts back in Washington, D.C. around helping support the efforts here we have in our state. But Senator Lee, Representative Curtis, Representative Owens, and Representative Stewart have also been very helpful. At the end of last year, President Biden signed into law the Great Salt Lake Recovery Act, sponsored by Senator Romney, which is going to study the historic drought conditions and help determine how to protect the long-term needs of the Great Salt Lake. And he also signed into law the Saline Lake Ecosystem, which was sponsored by Representative Moore, which has helped is going to help facilitate the assessment of not just the Great Salt Lake, but some other saline lake ecosystems across the West in particular. And these efforts are additive and have been very helpful to what we have going on here. This legislative session, we sat down and created a strategy for water in the Great Salt Lake. And there were 4 elements that were our priorities for the work that we just concluded. The first was to increase water capacity. The second was to expand conservation efforts across the state. Third was to prepare for the future water needs for our kids and grandkids. And lastly, how do we enhance the outreach efforts so everyday Utahns understand the role that they play and can make a difference? And I'm proud to report that these objectives that we had a lot of intention around, we made significant progress in all 4 of them. Let me just highlight a few pieces of legislation that I think were very impactful to the health and the success of the lake and Utah's water system in general. And now I can tell you about the bill that I was talking about a minute ago. Representative Mike Schultz, the majority leader in the House, ran a bill called the Amendments to the Great Salt Lake. And under this bill, we allocated $10 million one time and $2.5 million ongoing to stand up the office of the Great Salt Lake Commissioner. The governor did a great job of explaining to you the reasons and the benefits of this particular bill. But I believe this singular action of having clarity of mission and clarity on who owns the execution of that may be the most consequential thing we did this session in terms of the long-term impact of the state. We've got amazing work being done by a dozen different state agencies that all touch and impact the lake. This will increase the collaboration and the coordination between all of those different offices. So secondly, we passed a bill, House Bill 513, Great Salt Lake Amendments. We all hear about the production of minerals from the Great Salt Lake and the mining of things from the Great Salt Lake. Lithium is something that we're on the forefront of right now. And House Bill 513 says that as the production of lithium from the Great Salt Lake occurs, we will ensure that a healthy amount of royalties will come to the lake, and that money will be reinvested in preserving the lake, protecting the lake, and also managing the water quality of the lake. And it also says that if there is any use of water in the mining of lithium, that needs to be a net impact of 0 over time. And so a very, very important piece of legislation. Indirect to the Great Salt Lake, but impactful to not just our lake up here on the Wasatch Front, the Great Salt Lake, but water needs statewide, are some additional policies that are going to have a positive impact on the Great Salt Lake. And we've, over the last 2 years, passed dozens of bills that will have an impact there, that will increase water capacity and will also increase conservation. Let me just run through a few of those really quickly. House Bill 307, Utah Waterways. This was creates a public-private partnership aimed at promoting for Utah individuals and businesses ways that they can conserve water and optimally use water resources across the state. We've received on the private side commitments from a handful of private businesses and some nonprofits you may be hearing more about. That's not my news to announce, but some other nonprofits will be contributing to this public-private partnership to just help everyone in Utah have clarity what we can do as individuals. Senate Bill 53, sponsored by Representative Vickers and Senator Carl Albrecht, changes the way we will use and think about underground aquifers across the state, ensuring that underground water storage is a bigger part of our strategy related to water moving forward so that we can capture and use more water in years of plenty. Senate Bill 119 basically puts us on a level playing field. All the states around us that surround us calculate the way they use water differently than the way we use water. So it will change the way that we calculate our consumption to look just like the way Nevada calculates it, Arizona calculates it, et cetera. House Bill 450, and the reason that's important is it will actually help us draw down federal funds to manage our water needs in the future. And lastly, House Bill 450, sponsored by Representative Wilcox, it's going to make it basically easier to implement water-wise landscaping as we develop our state without unnecessary red tape. This year, we invested of taxpayer dollars here in the state of Utah over $500 million towards water. I know this is an eye test and you can't really see that, but it gives you a sense of all of the work collectively around water. And the majority of these things you see up there will have a direct impact and benefit to the Great Salt Lake. Over $1 billion in the last 2 years dedicated to water and primarily to the Great Salt Lake in one form or fashion. I know you know, but about some news that happened earlier this week. There's some awesome things about my job. And one of the awesome things is you get to really see the character of organizations and people in our state. And I got a call one day from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, unsolicited. I've actually had a couple calls from them. What can we do to help with the lake? I didn't call them, they called me. And we've had a number of conversations, and unsolicited, they made the decision to donate 20,000 acre feet to the lake, which I'm sure you've heard about. But just to put that in perspective, that is 6.5 billion gallons of water a year on a permanent basis that will be flowing into the lake that hasn't been in the past. And we've got other organizations, private organizations, that have water that are contemplating similar contributions to the lake. This, from at least my memory, is the biggest single donation of water to the lake, and super grateful, beyond grateful for the church's contribution and willingness to proactively step up and do that. I've said it before, but this is absolutely a team effort. Government cannot solve this problem on its own. Scientists and researchers cannot solve the problem with the Great Salt Lake on its own. And private businesses and organizations also can't do it on its own. Saving the Great Salt Lake and securing a better water future for Utah is going to take everybody's best efforts in this room and across the state of Utah. Let me be clear. To echo what the governor just said, one wet winter is not going to wipe away 2 decades of drought. Just because we've received significant moisture this season does not mean we're going to take the foot off the pedal in terms of conservation efforts. From my perspective, the battle has just begun. If we don't conserve water in years of plenty like this, our efforts are going to go nowhere. This year is more important in many ways than any year in recent memory. And this includes everyone. We need individuals, businesses, water districts, different organizations, and individuals to all help us take advantage of this year of plenty. If we're smart, if we work together, and if we listen to one another, I am confident that we can both grow and we can protect the amazing natural resources of our state. I think it's been made abundantly clear this morning that saving the Great Salt Lake and implementing greater water conservation efforts statewide is both no small task, and it's not something that anyone can do alone. This is a marathon, not a sprint. This is going to take a decade at least of concerted effort like we've had the last 2 years to save the Great Salt Lake. We saw at the beginning that Utah's water system is interconnected, and as such, every effort we make as a state of increasing our water capacity and expanding water conservation impacts the Great Salt Lake. Together, I know that regardless of political party or whether you're a native Utahn or someone that just moved here, we can conserve our great natural resources and water in this state and reverse the course of the Great Salt Lake and ensure that the Great Salt Lake and Utah's water supply remains strong for my kids and grandkids and their kids. Thank you for having me.
we've got time for one question. One of the questions that got some considerable interest was what assures, given these agricultural optimization efforts, what assures that water will end up reaching the Great Salt Lake? And is the legislature taking steps to ensure that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, we are going to see a massive amount of water produced, if you want to call it that, from these conservation efforts. And water law is complicated and tricky, but we have amazing partners in our water districts, and we're working with them on a regular basis to ensure that water will get to the Great Salt Lake. I'll give you an example. Even before our agricultural optimization program had any real implementation, I called the water districts last fall and said, we need more water. And they sent 30,000 acre feet down last fall without these conservation efforts being implemented. And so I am confident it's in their best interest to work with us on this. And we've got really great partners. So thank you. I really appreciate all of you. I'm sorry, I wish I could stay with you longer. This is more fun than where I'm going. So have a great day.
So we're running a couple of minutes over, and I'm just going to make the call here that we're going to let the next speaker finish up his remarks and not pay so much attention to the fact that we're starting a little late. I apologize about that, Bishop. Very grateful to have Bishop Waddell here and his wife, Carol. Bishop W. Christopher Waddell was born in Los Angeles, California on June 28, 1959, and married Carol Stansel in July 1984, and they are proud parents of four children. He was named first counselor in the presiding bishopric of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on October 3rd, 2020, and he was named a General Authority 70 on April 2nd, 2011, and served in that capacity until his call as second counselor of the presiding bishopric in October 2015. Bishop Waddell received a bachelor's degree in 1984 from San Diego State University, and beginning in 1984, he worked with Merrill Lynch in several positions, including first vice president of investments. Bishop Waddell has served in numerous church callings, including a full-time missionary in Spain, bishop, high counselor, and counselor in a mission presidency, stake president, and president of the Spain-Barcelona Mission in Area 70. Beyond that, he's a wonderful person I've spent a little time with the last couple of days. We're very grateful to have him here. Please welcome Bishop Waddell.
Well, it is an honor to be with you. I realize that some of that biography that you read, there are probably plenty of people that have no idea what any of those things mean, and that's fine. But it's wonderful to be with you. My wife and I have been in Utah now for just over 6 years. As was mentioned, I was born in Los Angeles. I was born and raised in the LA area. We raised our family in San Diego, and we love our time in Utah. We have a view of the Great Salt Lake. It reminds us of our view of the Pacific Ocean where we lived in San Diego. But the Pacific Ocean is still the same size. The Great Salt Lake is shrinking a bit. And so we realize that we all have a need to do something about that. But I am honored and grateful to be able to represent the church today. We're grateful, I'm speaking on behalf of the church, grateful for the invitation to participate in such a significant event as this symposium and for the work that's being done. I'm grateful for the things that have been said this morning. I'm not going to be quite as exciting as Governor Cox was. Watched him a little bit on the screen, and grateful for Speaker Wilson as well, and all who have participated in this event. I will apologize. I'm probably going to read most of my remarks that are prepared remarks. When you speak in a general conference at church, you have a big giant teleprompter that you're reading, and I don't have that today, so I'll be reading most of my remarks, but grateful again for the opportunity to be here. The Great Salt Lake, as we know, is one of the nation's true landmarks and an important resource for our community since 1847, and for the Native peoples prior to that. On behalf of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I'm also grateful to add my voice, our voice, as I said, to what has been said thus far today and yesterday, along with others who are engaged in this ongoing dialogue regarding the challenges we face and the solutions that are needed. Bishop Gerald Cosset, who's the presiding bishopric of the church, presented an address titled Our Earthly Stewardship in the church's semi-annual general conference in October of last year. Speaking to people worldwide, Bishop Cosset taught, quote, "The care of the earth and of our natural environment is a sacred responsibility entrusted to us by God, which should fill us with deep sense of duty and humility. It is also an integral component of our discipleship." Just days after that general conference, Bishop Todd Budge, the second counselor in the presiding bishopric, delivered a message on environmental stewardship at the Why It Matters conference, highlighting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals held at Utah Valley University. Bishop Budge said, "When it comes to taking care of the earth, we cannot afford to think only of today." He then continued, "The consequences of our actions, for better or worse, accumulate into the future and are sometimes felt only generations later. Stewardship requires feet and hands at work in the pretext with a gaze fixed on the future." He then shared various ways the church is striving to holistically improve its wise stewardship of natural resources, including agricultural land management, land management, energy management, and most relevant to our topic today, water conservation. And what I'd like to do in my remarks is divide them really up into three parts. I'd like to talk a little bit, and I'll share a little bit about the history of the church's involvement, and then current efforts, and then looking at future plans and the things that we're looking at to what can take place later on. So beginning with the historical efforts, the Latter-day Saints story, as most people know, the story in the Great Basin began in July of 1847 when the first company of the pioneers arrived. As Apostle Wilford Woodruff entered the Salt Lake Valley, he was deeply impressed with what he saw. He said this, especially notable to him was the large lake of salt water that stretched before his eyes. The pioneers entered a region where Native American groups such as the Ute, the Paiute, and the Shoshones had managed water resources for hundreds of years. Because of reports from earlier explorers, the saints understood that rain alone was not sufficient to water crops in the arid Great Basin. They would need to draw from the streams, the rivers, and lakes, following the examples of the Native Americans and Hispanic settlers that came before them. Almost immediately after reaching the valley floor, the pioneers built a diversion dam on what would become known as City Creek. And they dug a ditch so that water from the stream could soak the ground for crop cultivation. Over the next several decades, the Latter-day Saint leaders helped communities construct irrigation networks that brought water to fields and enabled agricultural production. The saints became known for irrigation innovations and their ability to construct works that supplied water to vast expanses of land, stemming from their desire to be wise stewards and not waste this precious resource. In an 1865 meeting with congregations from both Box Elder and Cache counties, Brigham Young taught, quote, "We should waste nothing, but make everything in some way or other minister to our wants and independence." Although today we recognize that there are times when water needs to be conserved, even if it could be used beneficially, Brigham Young believed that beneficial use reflected responsible stewardship over water. He also advocated for water to be held as a public resource and not in private ownership, which was a radical notion by standards of mid-19th century America. The perspective of water as a community resource shifted over time as more settlers moved into Utah territory and as the church itself became increasingly removed from farming and irrigation. This shift has continued over time, and actually, although the church still owns and operates some agricultural properties in Utah, it represents less than 3% of the agricultural land in the state. The 19th century saints continued to view rivers, streams, and lakes as important and vulnerable resources, and not just meant for irrigation. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, the church operated what was referred to as the Inland Crystal Salt Company that extracted salt from the lake and sold it throughout the American West. It also became involved in promoting recreation of the Great Salt Lake. For example, the church helped found the Salt Air Beach Company in 1891, and Salt Air became a popular destination for locals and visitors alike. Aside from the aesthetic of the lake that Wilford Woodruff found so pleasing in 1847, The lake had become a useful resource for the church and for everyone living in Utah. In 1937, however, there was a big change, as the Improvement and Beautification Committee was established under the welfare program of the church and recommended landscaping practices for church members and church buildings, including the planting of lawns, which, as you can see from this image, was greatly needed. The idea in the United States that well-maintained lawns were a desirable component of landscaping stemmed from the mid-19th century. Originally, only wealthy Americans with large manor estates had lawns. But after the Civil War, they became a status symbol for the middle class. A proliferation of lawns occurred in the 20th century, especially after golf grew in popularity in the 1920s. Acting on these larger trends, the Improvement and Beautification Committee promoted the planting of lawns at the church's chapels. Church leaders approved of this practice, in part because they wanted meeting house grounds to look clean and beautiful in preparation for the 1947 centennial celebration of the arrival of the pioneers to the Salt Lake Valley. The appearance of church and community buildings and homes, the First Presidency declared, mirrors the pride and industry of a people. In more recent years, the impact that caring for these lawns could have on water supplies has become more apparent, which is why we're here today. When drought affected Utah and other western states at the turn of the 21st century, the presiding bishopric implemented conservation measures for the watering of church lawns, including a 25% reduction in the amount of water used for landscaping and recommending the use of higher mower settings so that grass could retain more moisture. So that's a bit of the history. Now moving forward to more current efforts. In addition to steps that we can take individually and collectively, and that's been shared very clearly, the need for all to be involved in this, we also believe in a higher power that can be called upon. In an official statement made in June of last year on the importance of water conservation, the church invited its members to join with friends of other faiths in prayer to our Heavenly Father for rain and respite from the devastating drought, emphasizing that we all play a part in preserving the critical resources needed to sustain life, especially water, and we invite others to join us in reducing water use wherever possible. As the Apostle James teaches us in the New Testament, we must show our faith by our works, for faith, if it hath not works, is dead. Through our efforts, though our efforts have not been and are still not perfect, and we recognize that, there is a continual and ongoing church-wide effort to improve our care of natural resources, including the implementation of best practices and available technology to improve our water efficiency. I'll share a few of the steps that are being taken, which we believe will make a difference. On our farm properties, for example, we have installed soil moisture, I've worked on saying those two words together, soil moisture probes to inform irrigation decisions and the implementation of drip and microjet irrigation systems for appropriate crops. We perform regular maintenance and replace irrigation nozzles to maintain uniform water coverage. We individually tailor center pivot irrigation system programming to apply water at a variable rate based on soil types and observed low areas. And we are currently developing water management plans for all of our agricultural properties. Finally, we continue to install smart controllers, hydrometers, rain sensors, and drip irrigation systems across our many meeting houses, temples, and other facilities, and are encouraged to see positive impacts from these efforts. For example, from 2018 to 2022, to the end of 2022, we have saved approximately 40 million gallons of water each year at church headquarters. We are grateful for diligent efforts of remarkable employees who monitor our irrigation systems, as well as our indoor plumbing, cooling, and other systems, and whose efforts have identified opportunities to improve our water efficiency. In the early 2000s, a department referred to as the Meeting House Facilities Department began to adapt meeting house landscape standards by ecoregions within the state to better incorporate water-wise principles of regionally appropriate plant material accompanied by a reduction of lawns. This meant a transition away from more traditional landscaping, which included 80 to 90% lawns, towards a standard of 35 to 40% lawn for landscapes at new meeting houses, incorporating more water where grass species, water-wise grass species in plant varieties. Our current plan also includes specific practices for pre-growing, growing, and post-growing seasons. These practices include the implementation and monitoring of irrigation systems, adjustment of irrigation controls to comply with water restrictions and the weather, delaying first watering as long as possible, and applying water-saving products to lawn areas such as wetting agents and surfactants. The last item is actually the primary reason why some of our lawns maintain a little bit of green appearance despite a reduction in water usage. In 2022, as a result of these efforts, water use at our Salt Lake County meeting houses was reduced by 35% compared with 2020. Therefore, we are grateful to our contractors, facility managers, and local leaders who have helped us in this effort. Once again, we acknowledge that our efforts have not been perfect, and we invite church and community members to contact local church leadership if they observe any instances where best practices are not actually practiced. We encourage local leaders to be watchful stewards to ensure that our intended water management practices are appropriately executed and report any concerns to church headquarters. Now, looking forward beyond church headquarters in Salt Lake County, we are grateful for the many efforts being made on the BYU campus in Provo to reduce water consumption. In the past 2 decades, the university has reduced its culinary water use by 2/3, even as its building footprint has grown. Outdoors, BYU conducts regular water audits and uses smart irrigation systems and water-wise landscaping, including drought-tolerant plants and mulch made of campus green waste, food scraps, grass clippings, and wood chips. This mulch reduces water usage in flower and shrub beds by 30%. In response to heightened water concerns over the last decade, most of BYU's campus is now watered using secondary sources. The Water Master monitors stream flows and reduces flows, depending on conditions, by as little as 20% in spring to as much as 100% in late summer. As needed, campus lawns go dormant during dry spells. Additionally, on and off campus, BYU faculty contribute research on sustainable water supply, farming, and the Great Salt Lake. In addition to these water-wise efforts, in 2022, the church established what is referred to as a Sustainability Office and Sustainability Leadership Committee under the direction of the presiding bishopric. The purpose is to develop key cross-functional initiatives within church operations. We've expanded our teaching of the guiding principle of wise stewardship to emphasize the need to care for our natural resources and encourage our global employees to lead out in their efforts to implement creative solutions within the church operations that protect the future for all of God's children. So now moving to the future. Our ability to be wise stewards of the earth is dependent on our understanding of the natural resources we've been blessed with. As our understanding of the environment grows, so does our opportunity to align our practices with the environmental realities we face, allowing for the implementation of practical and effective localized solutions. We are indebted to the subject matter experts who study the conditions of the Great Salt Lake and the impacts and future risks of its declining water levels. We're grateful for the legislative changes that Speaker Wilson pointed out, many of them. We're grateful for those changes that create new opportunities to benefit the lake and the many organizations working to bring awareness to this issue. With greater understanding of the lake and of the solutions needed to help preserve it, we are positioned to improve our stewardship of this significant and critical resource. As a church, we are committed to be part of the solution to help the Great Salt Lake and have made some initial efforts to contribute. As was recently announced in the press release, and as Speaker Wilson just mentioned, and we're grateful for the comments, we're grateful for the expressions of appreciation regarding the contribution. But at the same time, we recognize that this is just a small part. We're grateful to be able to have participated, and grateful that I'm getting off script here. We're grateful that this effort working with the state will allow that water to be saved in perpetuity. That was a significant aspect of that donation, wanting to make sure that it would be able to continue, that it wouldn't be used for other things in the future. And so we're grateful for that. Well, thank you. We realized that, hopefully there are a lot of applauses for a lot of different people and a lot of organizations going forward, because we realize this is just a start, but we're grateful to participate in that. One of the comments that was made, the shares do provide approximately 20,000 acre feet, which is the equivalent of the amount of water to 20,000 single-family home connections. So we're grateful for that. And one of the items that we really appreciated on that is this donation will help preserve critical shoreline and wetland habitat in Farmington Bay. So we are happy to support the state's plans to improve water measurement and management, and truly hope that this will facilitate and encourage future similar transactions, not just additional ones from the church, which will come, but from others as well. Now, in accordance with HB 33, which was passed last year, we're also conducting an evaluation to identify other church-owned water assets that can feasibly be delivered to the Great Salt Lake, a continuation of our efforts that began in 2021. As a first priority, we are evaluating the water assets within the 5 counties surrounding the Great Salt Lake, as well as water assets delivered from Utah Lake, all of which we expect will have the highest likelihood of successful delivery to the lake. So it's not a matter of just looking for anything. We want the things that will actually make a difference to the Great Salt Lake. We know that every bit helps, and we do invite other water asset owners to consider the new opportunities afforded by recent legislative changes and determine how they might help in this important effort. We thank a large group of individuals and departments: the Utah Department of Natural Resources and its divisions of water rights, forestry, fire, and state lands and wildlife resources, the Nature Conservancy and National Audubon Society, co-managers of the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust, as well as subject matter experts from Brigham Young University, Utah State University, and many others that have met and consulted with our internal teams. Beyond the state of Utah, and as part of our long-term water conservation plans, we are making a concerted effort to extend water-wise practices church-wide, including expanding our use of technology, water management plans, and other best practices. We will continue to incorporate these water-wise and sustainable landscaping principles at our new meeting houses and temples along the Wasatch Front, such as the use of native or adapted drought-tolerant plants and trees, as is demonstrated by this landscape design rendering for a future meeting house in Vineyard. On a larger scale, our aim is to understand more fully what sustainable landscaping should be based on local climates, and to identify opportunities to conserve water and natural resources. This includes improving runoff water quality, collecting and reusing stormwater, mitigating the heat island effect, and integrating the landscape into the existing and regional context. We are currently working with landscape architects that are well-versed in these sustainability landscape principles and recommendations from programs such as LEAD and Sustainable Sites Initiatives as part of a retrofit pilot for select meeting houses across the state. We're excited that many of these sustainable landscaping principles are incorporated into our landscape upgrades for Temple Square and downtown headquarters properties. For example, we're implementing climate-based, this is a nice long word, evapotranspiration smart controllers. So our irrigation schedule, thank you. So our irrigation schedule will be influenced by real-time weather conditions, and we have grouped plants of like water requirements in hydro zones to further improve our watering efficiency. Now, just a few years ago in 2019, we began developing our water management strategy for new construction and retrofitting existing plants and soils. Our soils were chosen and engineered for water and nutrient holding capacity. All of our trees, shrubs, and perennial beds are watered via micro-irrigation methods and were selected for their low water use characteristics. Future visitors to Temple Square, when all of that is completed, we're hoping that won't be another decade or so, it's coming along. Temple Square will notice some key changes, including more trees, less grass, and more perennial plants. Our new tree count will be increased by 30% to reduce that heat island effect and to establish tree canopies that will protect the plants below and reduce our HVAC cooling of surrounding buildings. Our turf grass, on the other hand, has been reduced by 35%, and our annuals reduced by 50%. We've also executed a turf grass summer dormancy program in which all turf grass will receive 35 to 40% less irrigation water from June to September. With all of these changes, we estimate that in the first 5 years, as the landscape is being established, the total estimated water savings will be 40 to 50 million gallons from our pre-construction amounts. Once established, we estimate an additional 15 to 20 million gallons will be saved annually from those saved pre-construction amounts. As President Russell M. Nelson stated in his General Conference address in October 2021 regarding the Salt Lake City Temple renovations, he said, quote, "It is now time that we each implement extraordinary measures, perhaps measures we have never taken before to strengthen our personal spiritual foundations. Unprecedented times call for unprecedented measures. We're grateful for President Nelson's wise and optimistic call for continuous improvement in our spiritual lives and believe his words can be a clear guide for our efforts to be wise stewards as well. As a church, in conclusion, as the church strives to reduce its water use, we invite members of the church and community to also reduce their consumption. We encourage engagement and responsiveness to legislative changes and other recommendations from subject matter experts, recognizing the need to act with urgency and unity towards the future we hope for, one with a healthy Great Salt Lake. I echo the invitation given last June for all to pray and fast for rain and respite from the devastating drought, and for inspiration to know how we can each individually contribute to a resolution of this difficult issue. As the Lord taught the children of Israel in the Old Testament in Leviticus chapter 26, "If ye walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, then I will give you rain in due season, and the land shall yield her increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit." We are grateful for the snow and rain we have received this season has been mentioned, though perhaps not so grateful when we're shoveling our driveways, something we're not used to from San Diego. However, we have commented, as I've spoken to my wife about that coming in after shoveling, we can't complain because this is what we prayed for. We should acknowledge God's hand in providing us this blessing, and that our work is not yet done. We must continue with all diligence if we are to make the difference that is needed. May the Lord grant us all the faith and perseverance to be wise stewards of our water, our land, and the resources that flow through them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, one and all, and thank you particularly to our keynote speakers, and particularly Bishop Waddell just finished. We will take a break now. We will be back at 10:40. We're running a little bit behind our scheduling time, but we still have a solid 20 minutes, so we invite you to take a break, and we'll re-adjourn in 20 minutes. Thank you.